Good morning, and good morning to those of us in the Western Hemisphere, and good afternoon to those joining us from Geneva and Berlin, and perhaps other locations around the world. Welcome to the IOM webinar on the newly released report, Migration Governance in the Caribbean, the regional report on the island states of the Commonwealth Caribbean. We are truly excited to present this report after 7 strenuous months of work. My name is Brendan Tarnay, and I'm the Sub-Regional Coordinator for the Caribbean, and we are based in the International Organization for Migration, Regional Office for North America, Central America, and the Caribbean in San Jose, Costa Rica. I'm pleased to be with our 2 researchers of this study, Estela Aragon, Research Coordinator for the IOM Regional Office in San Jose, and Alia Al-Assar, researcher who is joining us via phone from Chicago, Illinois. Before I dive into the topic area for today, I'd like to go over a bit of housekeeping. In the slide here, you'll see that the audio video from today's webinar will be available at the events site for the Caribbean Migration Consultations. The website is there on your screen. We'll have a written rather than voice question and answer period for this webinar. To ask a question of the panelists, please use the chat function available at the right of the screen. Write to cmc@iom.int, or you can tweet at IOM_Caribbean. Should you have any difficulty in hearing at any time, please use the chat function, direct message, or email. Last week, we launched this report called Migration Governance in the Caribbean, Regional Report on the Island States of the Commonwealth Caribbean. This report was born out of a larger study, funded through an even larger project, funded by the United States Department of State Bureau for Population, Refugees, and Migration. The goal was to create a needs assessment for 10 Caribbean states from which we had relatively little information, and that were of particular interest to build capacities for migration governance. The larger study included individual country reports for each of the 10 countries of the study, which ultimately consisted of the independent island states of the Commonwealth Caribbean, which are Antigua and Barbuda, Bahamas, Barbados, Grenada, Jamaica, St. Kitts and Nevis, St. Lucia, St. Vincent and the Grenadines, and Trinidad and Tobago. Please note that these reports are under one last final review prior to distribution to the countries. These reports, as part of the larger project, are to help assist in informing discussions in the regional dialogue on migration, the Caribbean Migration Consultations. While we have yet to study all of the countries in the Caribbean region, these 10 countries and the regional report should help form future regional plans of action, focusing on key areas where needs have been identified through evidence collected from these first and secondary sources. The country reports are for internal use for the countries, IOM and PRM, thus they are not published for the public. However, the regional report is available for the general public, informed from the country reports and secondary sources. The regional report was the final product for this study that we are pleased to share with you today. And without further ado, I present to you Estela Aragon and Alia Al-Assar, who will provide a review of this new study. Alia and Estela.
Thank you, Brandon. Hello, everybody. We're going to start giving you a brief outline on the different topics we're going to be discussing during the webinar. First of all, we're going to give you a project overview. We're going to talk about the methodology that we use for this study, then reports and the main findings, the different uses and benefits of the information provided through the reports. And then we're going to have a Q&A in the case that you have any questions. As Brendan already mentioned, these are the 10 countries of this study. This is the research team: Brendan Tarnay, project coordinator, myself, Stella Aragon, lead researcher, and Alia Al-Assar, also a researcher. Right, so let's begin talking about the overall goal of this study, which was to inform the patients through increasing the knowledge on related issues in the Caribbean region. As you already know, we decided to focus on migration governance needs and on 10 island states of the Commonwealth Caribbean. Alia Al-Assar is going to talk a little bit about the scope and the purpose of the needs assessment.
Hello, good morning. Can everyone hear me okay? Okay, great. All right, well, this is Ollie LSR talking. So I'm going to discuss a little bit the scope and purpose of the needs assessment. So I believe it's important before we move forward to see what the needs assessment strives to do and what it does not strive to do. So first of all, the needs assessment serves a specific purpose, and what it strives to do is collect data on current governmental practices related to migration governance. So to understand what's happening on the ground, how these governments are managing migration, and what policies and protocols they have in place. From that, this needs assessment also strives to determine the main needs at the national and regional levels in terms of infrastructure for migration governance. And through providing this information and this assessment, empower governments to improve mechanisms addressing migration-related issues through contextualized and country-specific reports. As Brenda mentioned, the 10-country reports are for internal use, so these are primarily for governments to be able to see what's happening on the ground, to be able to share that information between agencies and develop protocols. So the needs assessment does not strive to rank countries based on their adherence to best practices of migration governance. We are not trying to compare countries' current status or adherence to the MyGov, which was the main framework that this study followed. And we're also not trying to pass judgment on current capacity levels or offer a one-size-fits-all approach to migration through this report. So now we're going to move forward to discuss the MyGov. I'm going to pass it off to Estella to talk about the analytical framework and the method.
Analytical framework in which we based this study was the MyGov, the Migration Governance Framework. We used the 3 principles and 3 objectives of the MyGov as the main dimensions to build the indicators and sub-indicators of the methodology. So for those that are not familiarized with it, the first principle, very quickly, the first principle of the MyGov is adherence to international standards and the fulfillment of migrants' rights. This has to do with adherence to international conventions on migrants' rights. Then principle 2 is evidence on migration and mobility and whole of government approaches. This is actually one of the reasons why we are building this study, so that we can better support both organizations and governments to base their programs and policies on data and on facts. Principle 3 is strong partnerships among states and other stakeholders, such as the private sector, civil society, and international organisms. Objective 1, advancements in socioeconomic well-being of migrants and society. This has to do with advancements in access to education, access to health, access to economic means, access to work. Objective 2, addressing the mobility dimensions of crisis, particularly important in the region of the Caribbean. And it has to do with tracking displaced persons. It has to do to providing assistance. Objective 3, safe, orderly, and dignified migration and mobility. This has to do with providing the means for and channels for safe migration, as well as having appropriate mechanisms for border management and security. As I already mentioned, we use the MyGov to build the domains of the data collection tool. However, in the reports, both the country reports and the regional report, we decided to present the information on these other 6 dimensions because we thought it was maybe easier to read and easier to understand for all the different audiences that we were focusing on. So these are the 6 chapters that you're going to find in the country reports, but however has an extra chapter at the very beginning that speaks about migration trends in the Caribbean. Right, so the method. This is, let's say, the roadmap that we used for the study. First of all, we started with collecting secondary data looking at all of the different information that is out there, looking at legislation, and trying to see what were the information gaps that we needed to address. Based on this, we built the tool. The tool, as I already said, has 6 domains, 59 indicators, and 73 sub-indicators. This was made to build the questionnaire that includes 286 questions. Questions were divided into questionnaires, addressing the main focal points, ministries, departments that we were focusing on. And of course, each focal point received the questions that were relevant for his or her work. We piloted this tool in Belize. We conducted some phone interviews to see how respondents felt with the questions and with the survey. Then we traveled to each of these island states, with the exception of Trinidad and Tobago. We conducted in-person interviews, and the questionnaire was more as a guideline for an in-depth interview rather than a survey per se. This way, the questionnaire was covering only the aspects that we were missing in the information we already had, and it could work more as a conversation in which respondents could feel more comfortable answering the questions and providing the information, and not that much of a survey of answering question by question. We did it this way, also considering that we had so many questions. So sometimes a respondent could answer one question, and actually he or she was responding to 10 different questions. After this, we drafted the preliminary reports. We sent them to all of the respondents, as well as to their superiors, because in some cases, respondents were, let's say, permanent secretaries, and in other cases, the respondents had more of a technical level. So in those cases, we sent the preliminary reports to both the technical level and the higher level to obtain validation. They provided comments, and with the incorporation of these comments, we drafted the final reports. We used a triangulation approach for both methods and for sources. For methods, we conducted, as I already mentioned, interviews. We filled in the questionnaire, and we made a literature review. For sources, we had different documents, as I already said. We had the RTSs, the thematic specialists from the IOM, and we also had the government representatives. Alia is going to speak a little bit about the different reports we were able to produce.
Okay, so as you can see, we produced 10 individual country reports for each of the countries of the study. As Estella mentioned, 9 of these countries were visited, and we conducted in-person and occasionally remote interviews with representatives from various ministries at various levels in the government in order to obtain the information on the thematic areas. The exception to this was Trinidad and Tobago, of which the majority of the information was taken from secondary sources. So as mentioned earlier, these reports are mainly meant to inform IOM on the needs, the real needs on the ground in terms of migration governance, and empower the governments themselves to enhance their migration governance framework by seeing gaps that have been identified and being able to share them across agencies as they see appropriate. So these are not for public dissemination. We can move forward to the next slide. In addition, we produced one regional report that is for public use that has been published. So the regional report offers a comprehensive view of the current state of migration governance in the subregion of the Commonwealth Caribbean, the independent Commonwealth Caribbean, and identifies gaps and needs for future development. The regional report contains a bit less individual detail into each country by nature of it is very expansive, it's extensive, and it's looking at the region, the Commonwealth, independent Commonwealth Caribbean as a whole, rather than looking at each country independently within the report. So I see we have a question from Susan, saying you got how the governments presented themselves to you. I'm sorry, can you elaborate on the question? So you got how the governments presented themselves to you? Okay, sorry. Right, so that, from my understanding of what your comment is, of course, governments will present a certain way in terms of what their policies are, how it's impacting migration governance, et cetera. While we weren't working directly with service providers, for example, we didn't go into hospitals to see exactly what was happening on the ground. We were able to meet with a fair amount of people at different levels. So working with people, for example, working directly in the nursing community, et cetera, so they could discuss with us exactly how it functioned, for example, when migrants come into a clinic, whether they have access, et cetera. And I believe that the governments, the representatives that we met with did offer a fair representation. Frequently, they would be honest about what they had in place, what they didn't have in place, and whether or not it's been a priority for them up until now. Right. Okay. So I hope that addressed your comment and clarified. But yes, there is an aspect of meeting with higher level and how they would like to represent themselves. Okay. So additionally, as Estella mentioned, the thematic areas across the regional report do correspond with thematic areas that were also in the individual country reports. The 6 thematic areas, which are migration policies and adherence to international standards, border management and security, management of emergencies and natural disasters, counter-trafficking, migration and health, and labor and human development. And additionally, there's an extra section at the beginning of the report, if you had a chance to look through it, that is migration trends in the Caribbean, which is not necessarily meant to be completely in depth about the history of all the Caribbean, but a bit of a primer to place the information in context. So I'm going to pass it off to Estella to talk about the findings and the main needs that were identified by representatives through our study.
Okay, so now we're getting to the most interesting, the findings. And of course, we're going to focus findings and we're going to speak about findings in terms of the main needs identified, because at the end of the day, let's remember that this is a needs assessment on migration governance, right? Also, we're going to speak about the findings of the regional report, meaning that we're going to be speaking about general regional needs rather than on country-specific migration governance needs. All right, so when it comes to the data collection, there is a wide spread need on collecting information on the growing intra-regional migration trends and on migrant populations, both regular and irregular. This is something that was highlighted in the countries that we visited that have not been able to develop appropriate mechanisms to very particularly track irregular migration and to understand how the irregular migrant population looks like in their own country. Also, there is a growing trend on intra-regional migration as some traditionally receiving countries have been changing their migration policies and becoming a little more restrictive. This has had as an effect a growing Caribbean population or Caribbeans migrating to countries within their own region. Then need identified also by the IOM specialists, a shared need, is the need to improve a whole of government approach to migration that is aligned both with international standards and with national development goals. Why? Because in most countries, with a few exceptions, I could mention that Jamaica is a really good example of this, but most countries have not been able to address migration issues in a coherent way and to make this as a shared effort and to coordinate appropriately between different ministries and departments. Also, most countries do have the migration strategy aligned with their development strategy, but not necessarily with international standards on the protection of migrant rights, and not necessarily with the SDGs. Even when most countries do have their national development strategies aligned with SDGs, most of them do not consider target 10.7. Then strengthening coastal surveillance to effectively manage irregular migration. This is something that was mentioned by most governments. As probably you imagine, actually monitoring and conducting border surveillance in an island can be quite difficult, especially in those states that are comprised by more than one island, such as Barbados, such as Bahamas, St. Vincent and the Grenadines. Of course, it's quite challenging for them to find enough resources to conduct this in a proper way and to find enough staff, enough personnel. Some of the most challenging things that they mention when it comes to border security. Then this is something that was identified by both governments and by IOM specialists. There is not information being collected on the effect and impact of the free movement regimes. And here we're talking about the CSME, and we're talking about the OECS regimes to allow the free movement of people and of goods. And there is also very little information on the impact of the citizenship by investment schemes. Some governments did mention security concerns when it comes to certain schemes and certain citizenship by investment programs that may not have many criteria to appropriately select those that can be participating from these programs. So this has raised some security concerns, not only by governments, but also by certain international organizations. And then the adaptation of emergency warning, mitigation, and response mechanisms to respond to the needs of migrants. These 10 island states are quite multicultural. We were able to see migrant populations from so many different places, from Spanish-speaking countries, from Arabic countries, and in most cases, we can think about maybe 3 exceptions and 3 countries which do have appropriate mechanisms to, for example, issue and disseminate information and warnings in cases of emergency in different languages, and to have emergency warning systems which do address the needs of migrant populations. But in most islands, this is something that does not exist, and we believe that is something that could be addressed. Alia is gonna speak about the next findings.
Okay, so in addition to the needs that Estella discussed, in the area of counter-trafficking, many governments identified a need to strengthen their legislation and protocols related to counter-trafficking. The majority of the countries do have dedicated counter-trafficking legislation. Some of them, actually Dominica has a section in legislation, but not a dedicated law. So countries have found the need that they need to revise their legislation, make sure it meets international standards, and is as comprehensive as possible in order to address possible cases of counter-trafficking, and additionally to enhance the capacity of counter-trafficking responses on the ground. So another issue that Estella mentioned in the previous slide is personnel. This was an issue found across areas. So personnel for counter-trafficking responses, making sure that they have enough trained persons. There can be a high level of turnover among counter-trafficking task force members or response teams. So making sure they have enough people, that they're trained well, that they are sensitized to victims, etc. Additionally, many countries found the need for the adoption of mechanisms to ensure migrants' access to healthcare and an improvement of screening protocols at border crossing points. So similarly to what Estella mentioned in regard to emergency mechanisms, to make sure, for example, that not only do migrants have access to healthcare services through legally, but also in practice, that when they do go to a healthcare provider, there are perhaps interpretation services or translated documents for them that make it accessible to them so that they can access these services. These are some types of mechanisms that will facilitate their access, not just in law, but in practice. Additionally, making sure that there are appropriate screening protocols and trained personnel at border crossing points to make sure that people entering who potentially need to see a doctor, there's a protocol to facilitate that process. There are trained personnel, and this is important for the health of migrants and for the health of the general population as well. Also, data collection on circular migration of labor migrants and the effects of migration on the labor demand and supply. Data collection in general was identified as a large need across governments across all countries. And on circular migration, this is a huge need because you cannot develop effective protocols or policies if you don't know exactly what's happening with the number of migrants entering, leaving, specifically with organizations such as CARICOM or OECS that do have labor migration agreements. So making sure that they have actual data on the circulation in order to facilitate policy and know how it's affecting labor demand and supply in order to make changes or make adjustments based on the reality of the situation. Additionally, we found that there's a need for the revision of legislation to ensure universal access to education for children of compulsory school age. While many countries in practice do allow children to access education if they're of compulsory school age, this may not always be reflected in legislation. There may be provisions in legislation stating that non-nationals may have to pay tuition, etc. So making sure that legislation reflects that practice so that it's enshrined in law and not just in the practice in schools. So we'll move to the next slide. So now that we've talked about the needs that were found in this report, that were reflected in this report from the governments, we want to talk about the uses and benefits of the report. So there are various actors that will benefit from this report. Did we pass a slide? Was there a slide before this? Great, perfect. Okay. So first of all, we want to start on the benefits for the IOM. How can they use this report? How does this help IOM? So there are a few things. First of all, it increases knowledge on migration governance practices in the Caribbean. There's generally a dearth of knowledge on this topic. So this is meant to be, a primer, give information on what's happening on the ground, what's happening in policies in the Caribbean, and what governments have identified as needs. Additionally, to provide information to facilitate the development of programs and initiatives based on real needs. So rather than implementing a program in the Caribbean based on a perceived need, we have heard now from government officials, we have listened to what they expressed as their needs to make sure that we work with them in order to implement and propose programs that work for governments that actually reflect what is needed. Additionally, to create a user-friendly primer on migration governance in the Caribbean for the use of all staff. So many staff of IOM may not be working directly in the Caribbean. However, it's important to have a general idea of what's happening what types of programs will be needed, what's going on with your partner organizations or offices. Additionally, for the governments, this needs assessment is also meant, as we mentioned in the beginning, to facilitate governments developing their own policies. So this is meant to enhance understanding of migration governance needs across sectors and agencies, as perhaps a finding we had was that sectors and agencies may not share information between themselves very transparently. So this is meant to also provide information across agencies to allow them to see what's happening, what other departments, ministries identify as needs, so they can work together to improve migration governance. And through that, develop evidence-based policies and mechanisms, and also enhance the open dialogue between these agencies to address the gaps and needs. We can move forward. Great. Okay, and so there are benefits for other actors as well. Benefits for civil society, also similar benefits to the previous actors, to improve knowledge on migration trends and migration governance practices in the Caribbean. Also to develop evidence-based initiatives and programs to better support governments. So to make sure working together, that they have information on what the governments have perceived as needs, where the gaps are, where they can fill those gaps, and identify priority areas for capacity building efforts. And other actors as well will view this report as useful. It can help improve knowledge on migration trends and migration governance practices in the Caribbean. Additionally, highlight information gaps for future research studies, as there's always room for additional research. And as we've gone through this project, which Brendan mentioned was 7 months in scope, there's always space. And within the report, we actually have highlighted areas that we view would be useful for additional research that we were not able to address through this report. And identify priority areas for investment in national economies. So for persons looking to financially invest in national development, in programs, to see where gaps are, this also provides some information on that topic as well. Great. So we can move forward.
You have any questions? Well, maybe first of all, I would like to also refer to the question that Susan made on the chat. If I'm understanding well, you're asking if we have any information on how these inform policies. The idea was not necessarily to make any recommendations on how to move forward and on what kind of policies they had to make, but only to present the information, very objective information on what countries have, what countries do not have, and what is the need, what are the gaps. The reports were actually, on their final version, were presented to the countries about a month ago. So we still did not have information, but we do foresee that these can help governments to better align their policies or better develop certain policies. We already know about some countries that are starting conversations to improve their efforts when it comes to counter-trafficking. So that is something that we reckon as something super positive, we're really happy about. And of course, in the IOM level, this is something that can be and is going to be used to look for funds and to better tailor our programs so that they address real needs rather than perceived needs. We have, oh, yeah, sorry. Susan has another question. I don't know if you saw the recent photo of Venezuela's landing in Trinidad. I expect this will boost enforcement and legal issues. Is not something we're addressing at the moment, at least not in this report. And also, unfortunately, we're not able, Trinidad and Tobago was the only country, as I mentioned, that we were not able to visit, and we're not able to collect information inland. So it's not something we actually have like first-hand information on. Anna, says, I joined late, so my apologies if this has been already addressed, but I was wondering if the research will expand to cover other countries, specifically thinking on Guadeloupe and Martinique, as it is important for Dominica to better understand migration patterns and such. This is extremely interesting, and actually, Anna, is the question everyone has, like, are we going to visit any other countries and conduct this study somewhere else? We are designing a similar study with the 8 member states of the SICA, which is the 7 countries of Central America plus Dominican Republic. We foresee that it's not going to be exactly the same because we need to follow different procedures, but this is also going to be possibly applied in Haiti. Certain territories of the Caribbean may be a little bit more difficult to conduct research on, so I cannot say with certainty that we would be able to conduct the study in some of these island states, but of course that we know that it is important, especially for the Caribbean, that what happens in one island very easily influences what happens in another one. Neely says, I know most of the interviews were with government agencies, but were you able to interview any CSOs that provide services, get their perspectives and current policies in practice and perceived needs?
Okay, hopefully, sorry about that. It looks like we had a bit of an internet glitch here. Could you just give us a quick, okay, wonderful. I apologize, we had an internet glitch here at the office. So we'll go ahead, I'll turn it back over to Estella to finish answering.
Yeah, so I was addressing Neely's question. We unfortunately were not able to conduct any interviews with any other organizations or actors involved in the issue. The only organization that we were able to have an interview with was with CIDIMA, that does plays a really important role when it comes to the emergency management and disaster management. So yeah, it was the only organization we were able to talk about, and the findings or the results of that interview were added to the regional report. So yeah, unfortunately that was the only one. Maybe that is something that we would be able in future studies to address, if we get a little more time, of course. It's also important for you guys to know that we had to conduct all of the interviews in 2 days. So yeah, it was just not possible to reach out to all of the different actors.
Wonderful. Again, if there are any other questions, feel free to write them in the chat. I just want to ask another question. Estella, what did you find in particular during, especially the secondary data collection, that makes the Caribbean unique as far as existing available data? We're aware that perhaps there isn't a lot of data, or that it might be a matter of limited legislation on these issues. I don't know if you could speak a little bit about that, and perhaps how that might be improved, whether in the country or how to expand upon it in the study.
Well, this is a really good question. I'm gonna give my answer, and after that, Alia, I would like to also get your view on this. On my perspective, there is very little information speaking about country-specific structures and needs, because most of the studies that are out there speak about the Latin American and Caribbean region as one single thing, when those who have worked or studied Latin America and the Caribbean know that these are two extremely, extremely different regions. The Caribbean is extremely diverse, starting from the fact that we have many different languages that are spoken just this creates an extremely interesting dynamic. We have islands that are, or countries that are sharing one island. One speaks Haitian Creole, the other one speaks Spanish. We have many different types of Creoles. We have the Commonwealth Caribbean speaking English, and then we have Curacao, then we have Aruba speaking Papiamento. So it's extremely, extremely diverse. So this is why I believe it's important to tailor studies and speak about the very island-specific context. Is something that I believe we were able to address with the country-specific report, with the country reports. I think this is, this is a really great benefit of this study. So that is one thing. Then the other thing that there's very little information on and is very specific to the Caribbean is the different regional integration organisms. So we have the OECS and we have CARICOM. CARICOM has been able to sit down with all of these different island states and to help them to agree on certain things and to develop certain mechanisms that are actually supporting islands that have, or governments that have little capacity, because we're speaking about sometimes of island states that have 70,000 nationals living inland and the same amount living abroad. So we have a CARICOM that is actually supporting island states on how to manage emergency, on how to manage climate change, on how to better engage with their diaspora population, and how to create freedom of movement regimes. And then we also have OECS. In some ways, we have been able to see that they do overlap. There is no information, as I already mentioned, on the actual impact that the creation of these organisms has had when it comes to economic development and to many other things. So this is something very, very specific to the Caribbean, and we do believe that more research should be done on this. Alia?
Yes, so I definitely agree with the comments that Estella made, especially regarding the need to look at the Caribbean independently of Latin America or South America, or just as generally part of the Americas, because the Caribbean is very unique, is very diverse within of itself. So if we look at the countries in our study, although they have many similarities, they're all independent Commonwealth Caribbean countries, we can look at Jamaica, which has a population of almost 3 million people, and compare it to St. Kitts and Nevis, which has about 55,000 people. So they have very different contexts and very different needs. And so when we're looking at data, certain countries have more capacity for data collection and have pretty rigorous systems in place regarding data collection on their labor market, perhaps on some types of migrants entering the country, whilst other countries, this hasn't been as much of a priority issue for them, as they haven't necessarily been receiving large amounts of migrants entering. So developing those mechanisms, having a systematic approach to monitoring what's happening in the labor market, monitoring who's working in the labor market, what skills they bring in, how they're adding to labor market, how they can attract more skills, how they can develop their national population as well. These are all considerations that perhaps have not been priorities because there hasn't been a need for it. So frequently when we spoke to countries, if there hasn't been a large influx of migrants that they've seen, they haven't necessarily implemented certain policies to manage it because there are other priority issues that they have had to manage up until that time. And I think additionally, when we think about data collection, it's also important to think about how these countries are perceiving migration. What is migration to these countries? So that may sound kind of strange, but in some of our meetings, when we would talk about migrants, it would become clear that they don't view, for example, internal migration. Those people aren't migrants. A Jamaican moving from one province to another is not a migrant, it's just somebody moving. So how are they defining migration? How are they defining migrants? And that definitely impacts how they're going to collect data on migration, how you're defining your terms. So I think that these are all important aspects to look at. And, you know, this kind of provides a starting point. There's so much interesting information that we got out of this needs assessment. And we have a lot of hope for what it's going to facilitate for the governments, for IOM, et cetera. But I think it also identified a lot of areas that perhaps we hadn't thought about that we need to look more into, and that we need to understand what is viewed as a priority to governments, what they're experiencing on the ground, and how that data collection can be conducted in order to facilitate what's happening in these countries versus if we're doing data collection on Central America, which the context, the situation is very different. So I hope that answered your question a bit of what I perceive kind of as the main needs in data collection and how this study fits into it.
Great, thank you so much. We're still looking for any questions. In the meantime, I've just got one other question. A prominent subject in the regional report is on border security and management. Are there any areas in particular that you may be able to speak to, such as border management systems or the need for capacity building through training, that overall the countries have expressed a need, or that IOM has identified any needs? I think that also may have to do with data collection or the training of frontline border officials, et cetera. I was wondering if you could just comment on any specific issues that you identified.
Well, as main security risks, what we were able to identify is that there is transnational crime organizations operating in the region. This has been identified mostly by international organizations, but at the country level, to track the activities of these organizations is still a need. They still do not have enough information or do not share enough information. Most of them do have systems that are integrated with the Interpol watch lists, but in most cases they do not have integrated systems with any other watch list, or sometimes this is not automatized. So meaning that if someone comes into the island, in most cases, they are going to be able to identify, because if this is, let's say, a person that is in a watch list, it should automatically be flagged. But there is about 4 of these island states that do not have that system. So it means that when someone comes in, they would have to have up the list, let's say, with the photos and everything, and to be able to manually identify someone that has been flagged or that is included in the watch list. This is extremely risky, and something that, let's say, even increases that risk is that within the freedom of movement regimes, people can very easily move without the need of a passport. At least in OECS countries, they, for example, only need a photo ID. And there is some information. Then again, I would like to highlight the fact that there is very little information, but there is some information that transnational crime organizations are taking advantage of the citizenship by investment regimes to be able to acquire citizenship in one of these islands, especially in OECS countries, so that they can very easily move only using a photo ID in between different islands. This has been identified as a risk by some of the governments and has been identified as a risk by IOM specialists, and is something that should be looked into.
Great, thank you so much. We haven't seen any other questions, but we are reaching the end of the hour, and I would like to once again thank Estela and Alia for joining us. I would also let you know, Sofia Cortez, our digital content assistant, will be in just a moment, be putting some information into the chat feature, particularly regarding access to the report, as well as opportunities to engage with colleagues and peers in the Caribbean and other experts and stakeholders through the Caribbean Migration Consultations website, the Caribbean Platform on Migration Governance. That link will be provided. In addition, I would like to thank the numerous IOM staff in the regional office, the Caribbean, and even to the Global Migration Data Analysis Center in Berlin, who assisted in the creation, answering questions, formation of the methodology, all the way to the very, very end through design and publication of the report. I would also like to thank, we would like to thank the over 100 government officials throughout the island states who contributed their time and effort in interviews, phone calls, and validation process. It was quite an effort on all areas. And then once again, we will hopefully very soon distribute the country reports to the countries in question in the study very soon. We're just going through one last final review. And once again, thank you all for joining us. I hope this has been informative. We would be happy to accept other questions or inquiries via email at cmc@iom.int and or to our individual email addresses that you may already have. Once again, thank you so much. And if there's nothing else, we'll go ahead and end the webinar. Stella and Alia, once again, we congratulate you on wonderful work and hope to see if we can implement this study in other countries in the region and perhaps even further. Thank you so much.